From Wondery, I'm Matt Ford.
And I'm Alice Levine.
And this is British Scandal. So, Alice, we've finished the story of the remarkable Paul Gazza Gascoigne. And as a football fan, this one has meant a lot to me. He was one of my heroes growing up, but reappraising your heroes can be difficult.
Yes, it's often what we are forced to do on British Scandal, reappraise these stories with a modern lens. And I suppose he is a prime example of one of those national figures, those heroes, who is made up of a lot of contradictions. And lots of questions are raised when you look back 30, 40 years at his career and his life. It's undeniable that he was a troubled figure. I don't think you could listen to this series and not draw that conclusion. His addictions, his issues with mental health, his difficulties with all of the public scrutiny. But I think we've come to a place where we've recognised that by focusing on that side of his personality, it's quite easy to erase another component, which is his abusiveness and his violence towards his ex-wife, Cheryl. So he was on this path of self-destruction, but let's not forget that that impacted everyone around him.
Well, our guest today knows a thing or two about being the subject of tabloid fascination and scrutiny herself. Linda Lusardi is an actress and model who appeared as a page 3 girl in The Sun for over a decade. During this time, she became close friends with Paul, travelling the world with him and supporting him as he was catapulted to fame in the 1990s. She joins us next. Linda, thank you so much for joining us on British Scandal. You started your career as a page 3 model in the late 1970s. Can you give us a sense of what that was like?
Oh, gosh, very different times to now. Well, I just had a ball. I really did. I mean, obviously, page 3 doesn't sit well with people now. But in that day, back in the late 70s, it was on the people's breakfast tables. They didn't turn a blind eye at it, really. It was sort of classed as, seaside postcard type pictures. And so, nobody challenged you about it at all in those days. They just sort of embraced you for it and celebrated you for doing it. So, I was having an absolute ball. I travelled the world doing calendars, and I did lots of pictures with my clothes on as well. But I was having a great time, getting paid lots of money and traveling the world and making friends, and it moved on to other things later on.
The height of your modelling career coincided with the emergence of tabloid culture, and with it a new kind of scrutiny and fame for those in the public eye. What was it like being the subject of such public fascination?
Well, for me, I always came off quite well because I worked for the newspapers, the Sun, the Mirror, the Star. They were always quite kind to me. So even if there was a story came in, they would ring and say, "We've had this about you. We're not going to run it," because I was their employee, really. So they weren't going to do anything negative about me. But yes, it did move from being a normal model that just appeared in magazines and in the paper to becoming more about you and your private life, and so on. But they always looked kindly on me. So I was very lucky in that regard.
And what about the nature of that fame and the way the public would treat you, and perhaps particularly men? We reflect a lot on celebrity culture now, but if you're famous for being naked and being an object of desire, did that affect some of the interactions people would have with you?
No, do you know, honestly, the only time I had to defend what I did was when Claire Short tried to ban it, and I sort of went on a few debate shows with her. But no, people were always very respectful. Most men were frightened if they met me. They were frightened to come up and speak to you. So no, I didn't. And people find it hard to believe I didn't get negative stuff. And obviously there was no social media then, so I didn't receive it, through Twitter or Instagram or whatever. So for me, there were no downsides to it.
A fellow tabloid regular was, of course, Gazza, who our series is about. Can you tell us about the first time that you met Paul?
Yeah, my neighbour came to me, the lady that lived opposite Jackie, and she said, "Oh, we've got a footballer that's moving in next door to her." So he would have been opposite me. And she said, "He's just signed with Spurs. He's only about 18 or something. I said, oh, how can he afford a house like that? And she said, well, he must be being paid a fortune. So anyway, apparently he tells me later that the estate agent said to him, look, this bedroom window is opposite Linda Lusardi's bedroom window. So if you're lucky, you might get a glimpse.
Oh my God.
And so we laughed about that afterwards. But he moved in and he was always very vulnerable character. He wouldn't sleep with the light off. So I was very surprised when he took part in Scared of the Dark recently. Yeah, so he used to come over with pies and things his mum had made that he'd brought back from Newcastle, and he quite often just spend an evening sitting watching the telly with us. He was quite lonely, really, to begin with, but he wasn't very well known. And my ex-husband was a big Spurs fan, so sort of went to the matches with him and things. So we became very close. He'd always come for Sunday dinner. He'd either be at Jackie's house or my house,
And as you got to know him better, was there a difference between his public and his private personas?
Not really, because he was as mad on screen as he was off. But yeah, he always had that Joker side to him, but he was always had a massive heart. He was always doing things for charity. And at the beginning, if somebody asked anything of him, he'd always be there, always give his time and energy until, he became mega, mega famous, and then he couldn't really move. I mean, he used to jump over the fence into Jackie's garden, and I'd put wigs on him and all sorts for him to get in my car and drive off. And then I'd meet him around the corner with his car and, so that he could get out the house, because they were always doorstepping him.
Dare I ask what your nights out were like?
Gosh. Well, I'd always end up going home well before him. And then the next day he would come round and tell us tales of what had gone on. But yeah, I mean, at one point, him and my husband were arrested. And I just don't ask is the word. Obviously I was in my 20s, so we were just behaving as 20-year-olds do. You drink too much and party too much and go clubbing. And
where were your go-to haunts, Linda? Where did you like to go?
Stringfellows. We used to end up in a Chinese restaurant a lot that used to sort of let us have lock-ins, and the Fish and Eels in Dobbs Weir, that was where we'd always end up at the end of the night, because the guy in there was a real Gazza fan, and he'd just lock us in and we'd drink till all hours, and we could walk home from there. So it wasn't too bad. But
what a sight, you guys walking home after a lock-in there.
Oh, I know. Oh, we were lucky we made it home, because we had to sort of go across a bridge over a river and everything. So
oh, yikes.
I know.
Was this a period when Paul was very popular with the ladies?
Yeah, I think it was really before he met Cheryl. So the more Cheryl was on the scene, the less I was. So she kind of kept him to herself, and that was that. We didn't sort of meet so much anymore.
As you said, you felt lucky to have somehow avoided what could be very cruel tabloid treatment. As he got more and more famous, were you ever worried about him being in the public eye?
Yeah, because he was just being used and abused, really. I did worry about him because he was such a giving character that he would always give the papers over and above what they'd asked for, and quite often it was used against him. He did struggle with it, but he was a dichotomy, really, because I'd book a restaurant for us all to go to, and it'd be a really quiet restaurant, and I said, can you sit us away from everybody? Paul's coming. And they would. They'd make sure that, they'd put a screen up or something like that. And he wouldn't be bothered. We'd be sitting there quite happily having a meal. And then he'd push the screen away and start throwing bread rolls at people. So he loved being noticed. He loved being in the public eye, but he didn't like all the intrusive sort of things with his family, and obviously the phone hacking and so on.
And why do you think the tabloids were so fascinated by him?
Well, nobody had ever seen anything like him, really. He was such a joker on the field and off the field, and he was just ideal for them because he was real paper fodder, And I think because he cried at the World Cup, people took him to their hearts. and kind of related to him because he was just so normal. He was just a normal boy of 18, 19. He was just enjoying life and enjoying the money, drinking too much, going out too much. But, everyone could see a little bit of their sons or brothers in him, and they just enjoyed the spectacle that was Gazza.
Do you think that's why people were drawn to him, both that relatability and that vulnerability?
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, I was drawn to him, because I think I was only maybe 8 years older than him, but I mothered him really. I looked after him. And I remember he came in one day and he was like really smiling. I said, "What are you smiling at?" He said, "You haven't noticed, have you? I've had my teeth done." And, he was just funny. He was just lovely to have around. And we felt quite privileged to be able to shelter him from some things. Obviously we couldn't shelter him from everything, but, we did feel quite privileged to be his friend. And we went over to, I think it was a Roma Lazio match when he'd signed with Lazio, and we had armored guards, cars, and people in, cars in front, cars behind, escorting us to the ground. And we had his own room. And because over there, if you missed a goal, I mean, I remember the weekend we were there, someone had missed a goal and a fan had shot at them afterwards. So he felt really under pressure. But, just to be part of that spectacle was just amazing.
Italia 90 was his first foray onto the international stage. How did he feel representing his country for the first time?
Well, he was extremely proud, absolutely proud. He couldn't believe he'd been picked. And, he was nervous. Quite often he'd have a drink the night before a match and sometimes go onto the field with no sleep at all. So to have that talent, when you're not really looking after yourself very well, was just amazing. And he was very young at the time. What a pressure for a person of that age.
Do you remember watching the match against West Germany?
Was that the one he cried in?
It was.
Yeah, I did. I remember watching it. I was up doing a show called A Kind of Magic up in Nottingham, and we actually stopped the filming. Everybody stopped the filming, and we all went into the green room and watched it on the TV. And I was a close friend of his then, so I really, really felt for him. Him crying just made me cry.
I was just a kid at the time, but I remember when he cried in that game and the whole national conversation about whether it was okay for men to cry, whether it was okay for men to cry in public. Do you think he felt an element of that stigma?
No, I don't. I don't actually. I think that was the way he was. He was young and his emotions came out. And I think, if anything, the nation loved him for it. I think he only ever got praise for being open about how he felt.
One thing that a lot of his peers say about him that comes across in various documentaries is, even compared to other players at the time, he had so much physical energy. Where do you think that came from?
I just think it was the pure joy that he had of actually being there. And he was very young, so he was very fit, and they trained them really hard. He was just top of his game. Everyone has a few years in their life where they're top of the game, and he was really there, just so physical. But, he would work hard at getting the weight off before matches and things. But it didn't last long, did it?
It was a time, as you say, where he was very young, very successful, huge amount of adulation, but also pressure, coincided with extraordinary wealth. How did that sit with Paul?
Well, I don't know personally, but I know that, he had a lot of people around him that weren't always doing the best for him, I don't think. So he was quite unaware sometimes of the amounts he was earning. It was all siphoned off here, there, and everywhere, and he had people dealing with his money. And he needed that really because he was so young. I don't think he'd have coped with dealing with it himself, but he was getting into debt in places where he had no idea. So he wasn't really in control of his own money.
You've spoken in the past about how Paul was his own worst enemy. How do you think he was able to balance everything at the height of his fame?
Well, he didn't really balance it very well. I think that's where the alcohol abuse came in, really. He is OCD a little bit. And at the time, back in the 80s, we thought it was funny because it had no label on it. We didn't know it was an actual condition. he wanted to please everybody all the time, and that is, as you know, is impossible. So he was trying to please his management, he was taking on too much, he was trying to play the games, but he was still had that Newcastle boy in him that wanted to go out drinking and enjoying himself as well, and the two just didn't mix very well.
The discussion now around mental health and addiction is so different, and there are a lot more support systems available. Who could he turn to? Did he turn to you?
He turned to his family, and he also turned to us. And I tried to guide him. I tried to, help him with decisions he was making and things. But, he was headstrong, and I was getting on with my life as well. And his parents and his sisters and all that, they had no experience in this kind of world. So sometimes the advice he was getting probably wasn't the best. But, I think he would have ended up the same man he is now had he not even been a footballer, I think.
Obviously, Paul's drinking habits are very well documented. Did you ever see the bad side of that? Did you ever see the fallout and that bad behaviour?
Yeah, with Paul's drinking, I mean, back in the 80s, I was as bad myself. We were all going out partying and drinking too much. Nobody ever thought that it was a problem until it became a problem many years later. So we were all party to it. It was just, it was lots and lots of years of drinking, and most people grow out of it. Well, he didn't grow out of it.
I might be being terribly naive here, but, over the years people say, oh, if only Alex Ferguson had managed him, or if only someone like Brian Clough had managed him, they'd have got him on the straight and narrow. Do you think that's just too simplistic?
Absolutely. Terry Venables really, really nurtured him and looked after him. Like I say, Gazza was his own worst enemy. Nobody could really stop him behaving the way he did, not even Terry Venables.
Obviously, part of his personality drove him to be the great success that he was, but I wonder if at times has he ever said to you, had he kept away from alcohol, he could have had an even more amazing career?
He's never said that, but I feel he would have had more longevity in the business, whether it be as a manager or a trainer or even as a pundit, but he's never actually said that to me.
Obviously, there was a lot of love for Gazza and a lot of support in the press when things were going well. When things weren't going quite so well, there was also a deluge of negative press attention. As his fame grew, so did the pressure of being Gazza, this icon. Do you know how he felt when the press began turning against him?
Yeah, I mean, like anybody, he was terribly upset. And the stories that were coming out, he didn't know where they were coming from. So he was doubting everybody around him. It's a mirror version of Diana, really. She didn't know who to trust and thought that the people that were closest to her were giving stories. And so did he. And he quite often came and said to us, I think so-and-so has phoned the press because they're the only person I told about XYZ. And of course, we didn't even think that the phones might be hacked. So, he felt really vulnerable and didn't really know where to turn. I mean, I lost touch with him for probably 10 or 15 years after I had my children and stuff. So I didn't really know him very well over the worst of it. We reconnected recently, well, in the last 2 years, really. Yeah, so, he didn't have much support around him at the time.
And did he ever doubt you? Did he ever say to you, Linda, you're the only person I've told about this. Have you sold this story on me?
No, because he knew that there's absolutely no way I would do that and that I was in the same position as him. There were certain, things that he knew about me that I wouldn't have wanted in the press. He knew that because I was in the business, that's the furthest thing that I would ever do. And there were, he knew that I didn't need the cash that the papers were offering either. So, whereas, some of his friends were taking money and things. So when they were getting stuff through the phone lines, he assumed it was the same people.
It's remarkable, actually, that Linda Lusardi and Paul Gascoigne are best mates in a period of tabloid speculation. Did anyone ever say, are you guys going to get it together?
I do remember when he was in hospital, when he came back to Princess Grace. Well, I think he was with Lazio at the time, and he came back for an operation on his knee, that my husband and I were walking out of the hospital, and they cut my husband out of the picture and said that I'd gone to visit him, and that was the closest to making out that, that perhaps there was a romance there. But no, never before that.
And in a parallel universe, do you think you and Paul would ever have got it
Oh,
together?
I couldn't have coped with Paul. No, I don't think so.
Said with a wink in the eye.
I'm a bit older than him as well.
Well, you said you felt maternal towards him and that you felt that you were a protective force in those early days. What did he bring to your life? What kind of presence was he for you?
I suppose if he was coming round for an afternoon, I knew that I was in for lots of laughs because of the stories he would come in. I mean, the things that he got up to other players, nights out. He was just full of funny stories, and he'd always come in with a gadget. He liked to spy. He used to go to the spy shop in London and come back with loads of gadgets and things. But yeah, no, I just enjoyed his company. My ex-husband was like with him most of the time and traveled with him and went to matches with him, went to Italy with him. And so we were very close. But yeah, no, I think he just brought a lot of fun to my life.
What impact did that have on your marriage?
Not a great one.
Oh, no.
No, I can't blame him for that. It was, my husband was in charge of himself. But yeah, it didn't bode well.
How so? Because of the partying?
Yeah, a little bit of that. And it was, we grew apart. I met him when I was very young, and 16 years later we were both very different people, and we'd grown out of each other completely.
But then you would never have met your second husband, and we as a country would have been deprived of Night Fever on Channel 5.
Oh, well, there you go. Can't be deprived of that.
A pivotal character in Gazza's story is, of course, his ex-wife Cheryl, who's a constant presence. In the early days of their relationship, I think it's right that you spent a lot of time with them as a couple with your ex-husband Terry. What were they like at that point?
They were quite volatile. Gazza was, he absolutely adored her. And I don't know that she was the best person for him. I didn't see an awful lot of love there, but they got on okay. And she was out in Rome when I used to go out there. But yeah, no, I didn't spend an awful lot of time with them as a couple. It was mainly Paul that we spent time with.
And were you quite protective of Paul?
Yeah, and I still am, like over the years when people have said negative things about him, I've always tried to say the positives because I've really only seen that side of him personally. He's an absolute darling. And I think that latest program he appeared in, Scared in the Dark, showed the real Paul, showed the Paul that I knew.
So difficult, isn't it? Particularly as a friend, it must be very hard for you. But as a fan of his, I have such conflicted emotions about him, and I often feel like perhaps I haven't taken the other side of him seriously, that perhaps in adoring him for all the wonderful way that you describe him, and I think as a country many people still feel that about Paul, perhaps we're guilty, all of us, of having looked the other way at perhaps the terrible way that he treated Cheryl.
Well, yeah, I won't comment on that. I mean, there's two sides to every story, and Paul really hasn't told his side because he's not like that.
No, but I guess we do know the things that he did, and he was very physically violent towards her. And I mean, that must be difficult as a friend when you're hearing stories like that.
Yeah, it is difficult. Yeah.
And would you ever talk to him about it?
I've talked to him at length about it, yes, but I wouldn't talk about it on a podcast.
No, I totally understand. It's just, I guess it's so difficult, and you obviously know him personally. He has such a unique place in our hearts as a country. I just wonder if perhaps we should have given more prominence to the other things that he was doing off the football pitch.
Well, like I say, there are two sides to every story, and Paul hasn't really told his side. I'll leave that for him to do one day.
I suppose this show is about reappraising these events from the past. And so isn't it important that we talk about domestic violence and talk about the complicated side of Gaza?
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much domestic violence that goes on that we never know. We don't know what goes on behind people's closed doors. And the more that people talk about it, the more that, the men out there that are perpetrators of it will realize that they shouldn't be doing it. That, I don't know. It's a difficult subject, really.
Yeah.
But
I suppose from our perspective, the difference with this relationship is that it wasn't behind closed doors. This was a very public relationship that was across the tabloids constantly. And so we did see the effects of violence in that relationship. And so that's how it's framed differently. It was a very public dissolving of a relationship.
Yeah, but again, Paul has sort of held his hands up to it. And, you have to forgive and forget. Well, not forget, but forgive people. I mean, he was suffering very badly with mental health issues at the time. I'm sure Cheryl's spoken at length about it. I don't think it's for me to sort of pass judgment on it. But obviously, I don't condone any kind of violence against women or men. And there's a lot of it going on. And the more people talk about it, the more people will feel they can talk about it.
You said that you rekindled your friendship recently. How did that come about?
When I had 2 young children and he was at the height of his drinking, really, I didn't really want him around, and we were quite clear about that. And, I was bringing up my children and everything else. I can't remember, but I think he rang me out of the blue and just to tell me he changed his number and we got talking and stuff. I mean, I quite often have to get him to text me because I can't understand what he's saying because his accent's so strong. But yeah, we just, a couple of times, 3 times a year, he'll give me a call and we'll have a chat. He rang me at Christmas and was just telling me, about the filming of Scared in the Dark and stuff. So yeah, it's been nice, it's been nice. And I'm glad that he, he's cleaned his act up and that he seems to be living life as a normal man now instead of somebody that's struggling with his demons all the time.
He looks so different now to how he did in his pomp and his prime. I mean, do you think as a country we should be worried about Paul, or do you get the sense that he's okay?
I think for the moment he's okay, but he's the first person to say it himself that he struggles to keep away from the alcohol. And I do fear for him because, there may come a day when you're getting that phone call that he's just overdone it. Your liver can only take so much, can't it? He does remind me of George Best, who I knew in those days as well.
As we've discussed across this chat, Gazza is a very complicated character and he's gone through many phases, even in his young life. How do you think he'll be remembered?
Oh, I'm sure when he's long gone, he will be remembered as being, the best footballer that Britain ever had. And I'm sure all the rest of it will be forgotten because when he was on that football pitch, he shone brighter than anyone. And he'll be remembered for his football, I think, in the future.
Linda, this has been such a privilege. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Cheers, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
That was such a great series to revisit. A hot summer where England failed to win a tournament.
I don't want you to think, though, just because you repeated an old one, that you get out of doing the next series.
I'm not trying to get out of anything. I am very excited about the next scandal. So I want you to picture yourself on the sandy shores of Ibiza.
I'm burnt, I've got heat rash, I'm homesick.
There's also a gorgeous man who asks you to do a favour for him that will pay for the rest of your holiday.
None of my suspicions aroused. Tell me more. In fact, don't. I'm in.
Well, that reaction is very close to what happened in real life to 2 young British women who became involved in a cocaine smuggling scandal which led to a spell in a Peruvian prison.
It often happens in British Scandal. That escalated very quickly from doing someone a favour and getting my holiday paid for.
Well, if you think that's extreme, you will love our new series starting next week, Peru 2.
I'm Alice Levine.
And I'm Matt Ford. British Scandal is produced by Samizdat Audio. Our producer is Millie Chu. Our senior producer is Joe Sykes. Our executive producers are Theodora Laludis, Stephanie Jens and Marshall Louis for Wondery.